All right, guys, we're back to chapter 34 of Alabama Moon. And yesterday, sounds like Moon had a heck of a day hanging out with Hal, mudding in the clay pits, shooting a machine gun, just getting to have a good old time, I guess you could say. Sound like a great time to me. I would imagine that was probably like one of the most fun days for Moon, aside from being able to live with Kit out in the forest for a while. So near the end of that chapter, though, Moon is starting to question what his dad's been telling him this whole time about going to Alaska and people that are like him, and why did he have to live out in the woods? Like, why couldn't he have any friends? And he's really starting to question all those things that Pap told him, and he's starting to think that maybe what Pap was telling him wasn't all true or accurate, I guess you could say. And Hal's dad is talking to Moon and was asking about his dad and his family, his background, like maybe what caused him to live out there. I think Hal's dad talked a little bit about Vietnam. Remember, this is the early 80s, so Vietnam is still pretty fresh in people's memory, especially, it sounds like, I mean, if Hal's dad has a machine gun, there's a good chance that he's of the age or would have been of the age of somebody that fought in Vietnam, which I think he made a comment like, "Nah, man, you'd have given him some serious hecking back in Nam." So, yeah, so just Moon's starting to question everything he knows, which is kind of a big deal. So that's where we left off. This is chapter 34. The other thing too, Mr. Hal's dad had asked if Moon's dad had ever talked to anybody before, if he's got any family or any friends. He's like, just Mr. Abrascato. And so Hal's dad suggested that maybe Mr. Abrascato knows, maybe he knows more about Moon's background in history. So chapter 34. A couple of days later, Hal and I took the truck to get my things at the old shelter. Mr. Mitchell told us to drive to Union and head south to get to Gainesville. We'd pass through town, and then I'd start recognizing things. Your daddy doesn't mind you taking his truck out of here by yourself? I'm going to Helen Wilder just as fast as I get caught driving as I do walking. You're not going to get caught. That's what you always say. And you've been caught at least once. They can't keep me, though. Hal laughed. We got laundry to do, too. Where are we going to do laundry at? Laundromat? I've never been to a laundromat. You ain't never been to a lot of places. That's the place you told me they have a phone, right? Yeah, and they got good-looking girls. I don't care about girls. I want to use that phone. We're going to call him soon. He hasn't been there that long, but they said he was okay, right? Yeah, I told you that already. He's okay. Good. I could tell we were getting close to where I used to live by the smell of the forest and the types of the trees I was seeing. We're almost there, I said. You recognize all this? Yeah. It wasn't long before we came to a bridge over the Noxubee River. Hey, stop right here, I said. Hal pulled over and stared at me. I got out and scooted on my rear end down the hill to the swamp. When I got to the bottom, I heard Hal yell at me from above. Man, what do you want an old wheelbarrow for? Hal asked. It's mine. Sanders threw it down here. That the one you've been talking about? Yeah, that's the one I hauled my pap around in. Jeez. You need some help? No, I got it. It's just jabbed down in this mud pretty good. I finally managed to get the wheelbarrow out of the mud and drag it back up to the truck. Hal helped me put it in the bed, and then we set out again. A few miles down the road, I told him to pull over once more. This is it, I said. You wait here, and I'll be back in a little while. I'm going to stop there for a second. I find it fascinating that Moon has lived there so long that he recognizes the smell. I know, like, when I go back home to where I grew up back in Illinois, as soon as I'm close and I start recognizing trees and buildings and farmland and houses and areas that are familiar to me, I get all fuzzy feeling inside. But I never thought that my other senses, like what I smell, would stand out to me. So I think it's neat that Moon's pretty well in tune to what the forest might even smell like as he's getting closer. Like, that's how he recognizes it. So I just thought that was a cool detail in the story. There ain't nothing here. I got trails out there that I can take to the shelter. All right. How long's a little while to you? I shrugged my shoulders. Ugh, that's what I figured. How about I go to the laundromat and come back? All right, I said. You can find me later. I bent over and picked up a stick. I stabbed it in the ground. Right here. I felt my feet fell quickly on the old footpaths like I had just left the day before. I picture what lay before me all the way to the shelter, every crook in the path, low branches, rise and fall, gurgling creeks. The patterns and sounds of the patch of forest where I had lived for so long came back to me. I had run the trails so many times that I knew how firm the ground was before every step. I knew enough about what lived in the bushes and trees around me to tell the time of day by their movements and sounds. After an hour and a half, I was close to the shelter, yet I got the feeling that something was wrong. Somehow things were different, but I didn't know how. I slowed to a trot, and finally I took off my shoes and I walked on the outsides of my feet. I approached the clearing, and suddenly I knew that it was the forest noises that weren't right. A disturbance had passed through and left silence behind it. Scattered about the clearing were our tools and the few items of furniture Pap and I had in the shelter. The curing barrel was knocked over. Parts of the roof were pulled away. I walked slowly into the shelter and found it unusually bright inside from the sunlight that had beamed through the holes in the roof. The hide pile was thrown about the room, and a jar of nails lay shattered and spilled where the cupboard had been. Pap's books were in a soggy pile on the floor. I wasn't sure what I was feeling. I wasn't mad. I wasn't unhappy. I was confused. So who do you think tore up the shelter? Sounds like somebody went in there and tore it all apart. I also think their shelter's pretty cool. Like, it reminds me of, I know it's kind of silly, but it reminds me of Winnie the Pooh, like the animals living inside the trees and all that stuff. In the forest in Winnie the Pooh. It sounds like I love forts. Like, I think it'd be cool to have a tree house, that kind of stuff. So having this like house built into the roots of the trees that grew around it, down into the ground, into a hole, that sounds like cozy and cool and like a cabin to me. So kind of neat. Remembering what I had come for, I felt around in the ceiling supports and my hand touched Pap's rifle. I pulled it from its hiding place and looked it over. It was in pretty good shape, except for a little rust on the barrel. I found our tube of grease on the floor and squeezed some onto a rag. I gave the rifle a rub down and then stepped back out of the shelter. Wasn't anything I could have done about this, Pap. I said out loud, I guess I'm not supposed to be here anyway. I'm supposed to be in Alaska by now. All I wanted was the rifle. I turned my back to the shelter and stepped into the forest once more. This time, I took a path down through a cane thicket and across a stream where I used to run traps. I crossed a rusted barbed wire fence that Pap once said looked to be 100 years old by the way it was grown into the sides of the trees. I moved quickly through the hills and valleys and across Mr. Wellington's dirt road and back into the forest. After a while, I heard cars on the blacktop. I came out of the trees and continued the half mile up to Mr. Abrascado's store. I saw him through the window that looked over the gas pumps. His back was to me, and I knew that he was watching television above the tobacco shelf. He didn't turn when I walked in, and the little bell jangled on the door. I stood there watching him and feeling nervous about how he would act. My hands were tired of holding the rifle, so I set the butt of it on the floor and held it at the end of the barrel. Hey, I said. He turned and glanced at me briefly, and then he looked again and stood up. Moon? I nodded at him. Is that you? Yes, sir. He leaned over the counter and stared at me like he couldn't see very well. Hardly recognized you without all your hair. I rubbed my head and I nodded. Mr. Abrascado looked like he didn't know what to do. Hey, why don't you put up that gun, he said. Well, you might take it from me. Why are you standing there holding it like that? Because I was carrying it. You got it loaded? It's always loaded. Hey, I'm not comfortable with you standing there with a loaded rifle in my store, Moon. You think I'm going to shoot you? No, you're not, are you? I never shot anybody. I wouldn't shoot you, Mr. Abrascado. He walked around the counter and came to stand before me. He was still watching me in a way that made me nervous. Well, set it over there by the door anyway. I glanced behind me, careful to keep him in sight, and saw a place near the door where I could lean the rifle and still be able to grab it quickly if I had to run out. I leaned it against the wall and faced Mr. Abrascado again. Hey, I wanted to ask you about my Pap. You know how many people are looking for you, Moon? I know Sanders is after me. Mr. Abrascado nodded. Yeah, he's in here at least twice a week asking if I seen you. I think he tore up our old shelter. I just came from there. I hate to think what he's going to do to you when he gets his hands on you. You shouldn't mess with people like him, Moon. Maybe he won't catch me. After everything he says you did to him, he's going to give it all he's got. You know, you could get me in trouble being here. I don't need this kind of trouble now, Moon. That's why I'm standing by this door. You tried to turn me in once already. Mr. Abrascado shook his head and stepped behind the counter. Well, you want to know about your father, do you? That's right. Why'd he bring me out here? He turned and looked at me and leaned against the tobacco shelf. Well, all right, why don't you sit down and I'll tell you what I know. I slipped down the wall and to the floor. Moon, I didn't meet your father until you were about 2 years old. He had just moved out into this forest, and he had you and your mother, Caroline, with him. They carried you around in a burlap sack with a piece of hemp rope, some kind of papoose set up. Neither one of them talked much. They'd tell me what they wanted, trade a few things, and then they'd be gone. With me in the sack? That's right. Nobody knew where y'all went out there in that forest. You'd think that after knowing your father all these years that I have some idea where it was that you lived, but he was careful to cover his tracks. I don't make a habit of getting into another man's business. Mr. Abbraccato reached down and took a sip of cola that was on the counter. Anyhow, your father and I talked once after your mother died. He came in here with you late one afternoon as I was closing and sat down on the floor just like you're doing now. He told me that she was dead, that he'd buried her in the woods. I asked him if there was anything I could do, and he just shook his head. He was quiet for a long time. He never could tell what he wanted. It was the only time I thought maybe he was going to tell me something about himself. Finally, he asked me if I'd ever been in a war, and I said no. He said, once you've been in a war, you don't need much to live. I took that to mean that he had gone to Vietnam, and something happened to him over there that made him want to live like the way he did. Well, what happened in Vietnam? Well, what happens in most wars? People get killed. However, a lot of people didn't think we should have been over there. They made Pap go and he didn't want to? Something like that. Is Sanders mad at Pap about Vietnam? No, I don't think so. Why won't he leave me alone? You're starting to learn that life's not as simple as you thought it was, Moon. There's mean people out there. Sanders just has a bad streak in him. I told him a bunch of times I wasn't scared of him, and he's still after me. I know you're not scared of him, Moon. You're not scared of anything. And you're screwed up, Moon. You're all messed up. You got no sense of reality. You got to get some help. I stood and grabbed my rifle. Mr. Abbraccato ducked behind the counter. Hey now, hey! I stood there with the rifle in my hands, watching the counter. Moon? He called out. What? What are you doing? I'm leaving. Mr. Abbraccato peered slowly over the counter. I can tell you're not my friend, I said. I am your friend, Moon. I just know you need help, and I'm trying to talk some sense into your hard little head. You don't know anything about me. I've known you longer than anybody except my Pap. You know I wouldn't shoot you. Mr. Abbraccato shook his head. I'm sorry, he said. It's just that the news said... I turned and left. I sat inside the edge of the forest for about 15 minutes before Hal pulled up near the stake that I'd used as a marker. I stood and walked to the road holding Pap's rifle. Hal watched me out of the truck window. Hey, what kind is it? It's a .22. That all you wanted? I climbed back into the truck, put the rifle between my legs. Nah, but you better bash that gas pedal. Aw, what'd you do now? Well, I went to that store. Mr. Abbracato's likely to have Sanders around here looking for me. Oh, crap. Hal said he slammed down the gas pedal and the tires threw dirt until they caught the asphalt and squalled. I wanted to ask him about Pap. I should have seen that coming. He said Vietnam made him want to live out in the forest. Are you happy now? No. What happened in Vietnam? I don't know. Why don't you ask Daddy? I will. You know what else? What? Someone's been to my old shelter and torn it up. Are you mad about it? I shook my head. I don't care now. Nothing else there I needed. Hal turned the truck around and we headed back towards Union. I kept looking in the rearview mirror for a while, then relaxed. You hungry, he asked me. Yeah, you? We'll stop up here at the Lock and Dam. I got some Vienna sausages and crackers. You okay? Yeah. Hal looked at me sideways. All right. We stopped at a point along the river where we could see the lock and sat on the tailgate. I pulled a sausage from my can and put it between two crackers and took a bite. It's pretty good sausage, I said with my mouth full. Yeah, they're pretty good. What do you want to do this afternoon? You know what I want to do. Ugh. All right, fine. We'll go call him. I swear I ain't taking you to visit everybody in this whole damn state.